So what I'm saying is that they're not okay. So if you have what dualism basically is, right, is two contrary principles, right? It's a position of that reality is composed of two contrary principles, that they're irreconcilable. Like you said contradictory or incompatible. So they're incompatible, right? So they're if they're incompatible principally at like the base primary level, they're irreconcilable. And if they're reconcilable, then they're not incompatible. They're just a polarization of the underlying principle. So in your example of the tornado, for instance, if you have this kind of polarity, and that's what it is, what should be, right? Between cold and hot air, they're never in the same spot, right? Depending on where in the tornado. Well, of course, they're both reconciled by the underlying like tornado itself, or the laws of nature that are, uh, giving way to the phenomena of the tornado. Whatever one of those you want to go with to kind of like counter that analogy. But the thing is, what I'm saying with dualism is that if you have contradictory terms that aren't reconciled by an underlying principle, you have what amounts to, I don't think I use the word impossibility, but you have an impossibility because you need a relation between those terms. Because, for instance, take the example of the tornado. Those two terms are related. They exist relative to one another, right? Which means there's something underlying relating them. Whatever we want to say that is, we could just say, for keep it simple, it's the tornado itself. So, and like, okay, like don't get me wrong, in Hermeticism, there's or in kind of like neo Kabbalionic Hermeticism, which is still really good. There's yeah, yeah, polarity, right? And yeah, and polarity is basically like dual aspect monism or monism, and it basically maintains that there's this kind of universal polarizing impulse. And even if you look at like Greek metaphysics, the concept of aoristos dyad or the indefinite dyad is, or just the dyad generally in Pythagorean systematics is pretty similar because you have this, or even just gender, like in the Kabbalion is kind of like almost the same thing as the principle of polarity. It's this initial polarizing impulse from a totally unified state into, you can almost think of it like if reality were at one point pure and simple, well, the beginning of differentiation would have to be a polarizing impulse, right? Because you'd have to have the first difference, kind of. And I think that's part of the idea of the dyad. So basically, all I'm saying is, well, yeah, let me summarize that a little bit. If you have contradictory terms that aren't principally reconcilable, and just to kind of clarify what I mean by principally, is I mean they have to have like a common underlying nature, right? Um, Otherwise, for instance, if that wasn't the case, and Chris Langan is the one who kind of inspired my use of like the relational medium, but I can comment more on that like after this chat. I can send some stuff to the group chat. But everything in reality is related, so you have to there has to be something that's like allowing for that relation. There doesn't have to be like some physical medium, even though there kind of is. Um, there just has to be some principle that allows for that relation between things. So it kind of defaults to monism. But if you have contradictory terms that are contradictory in principle, their relation is impossible, is basically what I'm saying. My position against materialism. Man, let me think of how I should best approach my position against materialism. Well, I mean, you have a bunch of stuff like the Leibniz gap and the hard problem of consciousness, but like, yeah, actually, that'd be a good way to approach this. Is you have things like mind. you have things like consciousness, and you have a really good way to illustrate this is you have the imagination, you have images in the imagination, um, and these things are irreducible to particles, right, or even particle interaction. You can't like point to the images. Like for instance, there's no there's no like particles recomposing themselves on the back of your eyelids when you imagine something, right? This is a totally immaterial thing, and even calling it like some kind of illusion pushes the question back because you have to still answer what's causing like the immaterial phenomenon, right? So, like at the very least, uh, without like some kind of weird convolution of terms, you have Cartesian dualism, right? But then you have to reconcile because there is a relation between mind and matter. Like literally, you are relating the two right now, and you can't. There's no like good explanation out there for matter creating mind because mind is something immaterial, and why would the principle of matter create something contrary to its own principle, right? Why would it create something immaterial? It makes no sense. And it would admit that there is this immaterial nature latent in matter, but it just doesn't make sense. So then you have basically the primacy of mind, or maybe mind sounds. A lot of people don't like that because um, it sounds too mundane, like we're making our own minds primary. But you could say the ideal principle, or the immaterial principle, should be primary then. And yeah, I'd say that you you go from there has to be an immaterial principle, so you have at least some kind of dualism wherein both things exist, and then you kind of necessitate the primacy of mind. And we all the time get demonstrated or have a demonstration of mind being able to produce images, right? Because you have an imagination, you have dreams, you have all these things. Mind produces images internally to itself, right? So there is an example if the material world is some kind of macrocosmic, like the external world is a macrocosmic image of some kind, you have an example of mind creating matter, but there's still this massive explanatory gap for matter creating mind, and that's called the Leibniz gap. So that's my position against materialism, I'd say. Just off the top of my head. Yeah, so the Leibniz gap is basically it's basically what I said about mind not being able to be produced by matter. It's like the gap between a material principle not being able to produce something contrary to its nature, that being an immaterial principle, and if it does, it it immediately admits a kind of either representation of the immaterial, because there's an explanation for like in a an idealist system for that isn't contradictory for like brains and all that. It's not saying like these things are arbitrary, but there's nothing in the materialist system that can kind of explain the advent of immaterial natures without basically just saying no, it's an illusion, it's fake, it just doesn't uh, like no, it doesn't seem legitimate. But just to get good, more concise, just in case I'm kind of projecting myself on that, I'll give you the Wikipedia real quick since I'm on my computer. 2 seconds here. Okay. The philosophy of mind, Leibniz's gap, is the problem that thoughts cannot be observed or perceived solely by examining brain properties, events, and processes. So yeah, basically that you can't uh, you can't observe the immaterial thing in the material reflection. You can't like observe thoughts in itself or images or any of these things. So that is. Oh yeah, and let me read the section from monadology that that the Leibniz gap is named after, since we were talking about monadology earlier. It must be confessed, moreover, that perception, and that which depends on it, are inexplicable by mechanical causes, that is, by figures and motions, and, supposing that there were a mechanism so constructed as to think, feel, and have perception, we might enter into it as a mill, like a windmill, like if it were magnified. He talks a little bit, there's a little bit more than this is going to show us. And this granted, we should only find on visiting it pieces which push one against another, but never anything which or by which to explain a perception. This must be sought, therefore, in the simple substance, and not in the composite or the machine. And by simple substance, he means the monad, or of which human souls are a type of monad, if you read through monadology. But yeah, that's a pretty. I'd say that's probably very solid uh, front against materialism.